For so long, Lida Diep lived with questions buried deep in her heart. Where are my relatives now? Do they still remember me? Will they recognize me when we meet again? Years have passed, faces may have changed, but the longing remains the same. A quiet ache for connection, for belonging, for that one embrace that says, "You were never forgotten." And now, as the possibility of reunion draws near, Tu Diep's heart races between hope and fear. What will happen when they meet again? Will it be tears, silence, or healing? Perhaps all three. Because sometimes, the most powerful moment in life isn't when you find success, but when you find your way back to those who once held you close. The wind blew gently across the quiet village road, carrying with it the scent of blooming jackfruit and the distant sound of chickens clucking. It was almost sunset. Lida Diep stood barefoot at the edge of the small rice field behind her house, the orange light painting her delicate face in gold. But her heart was heavy. She had just come back from a conversation that left her shaking, not from fear, but disbelief. Pao, her former husband, a man once feared for his cruelty, had returned with trembling hands and sorrowful eyes. He claimed to have changed, and more than that, he had brought a truth that shattered her world once again. "Your parents are not dead, Diep," he said quietly. "They are still alive, and you were never meant to be an orphan." Diep froze when she heard it. For more than 20 years, she lived with the belief that she was abandoned, unwanted, unloved. Raised by an uncle who treated her more like a servant than family, sold into marriage at a young age, and left to survive in silence, she had buried her past deep beneath the surface of survival. Now someone had reached in and pulled the truth to light. Pao claimed that her uncle, the man who raised her, had lied to protect his own interest, that Diep's parents were poor and powerless, and he had convinced them to give her up, out of shame, out of desperation, or worse, out of greed. But why would he do that? And why now, after all these years? Diep didn't want to believe it. She couldn't. Yet something inside her, a whisper that had always lived quietly in her heart, told her this was not a lie. It was a secret waiting to be uncovered. She told James everything. He stood in silence as she cried. Then, without a word, he pulled her into an embrace, strong and steady. "We will find them," he said simply, "whatever it takes." And so began a new journey. They left the village once more, traveling to distant towns, dusty record halls, forgotten orphanages, and government buildings where papers had faded and memories had become shadows. They chased names, fragments, and old voices, some kind, others reluctant to speak. Finally, a breakthrough came. An old neighbor in a remote northern town recognized the name Lai, her family name. The woman was old and half blind, but when she looked at Diep, her voice shook.
"You look like your mother." The woman gave them directions. A mountain village almost unreachable by road. They walked for hours under the sun, through thick trees and broken paths, until they reached a wooden house near the river. It was small, simple, and quiet, and there, sitting on a wooden stool, was a woman in her late 60s, peeling cassava.
She looked up, her eyes locked with Diep's. Time stopped. Diep's knees buckled. Something inside her, too old to name, too deep to describe, recognized the woman without a word. "Mother," she whispered. The woman dropped the cassava and stumbled forward. "My daughter, my daughter." They embraced, both weeping, their bodies shaking with years of pain, of guilt, of longing. Her mother explained everything, how they were forced to give her away during a time of famine and debt, how they searched later but were told she had died, how they grieved her in silence for decades. Diep's father had passed away 5 years earlier, still whispering her name. When the rest of the village heard the news, distant cousins, aunts, and even an old grandmother came. Some didn't recognize her. Others cried and kissed her hands. The reunion was messy, imperfect, emotional, and beautiful. Diep didn't know how to process all of it. She still didn't understand why life had been so cruel for so long. But she knew one thing: her bloodline, her name, her past. They were no longer just memories. They were real. Alive. Here. James stood at a distance, watching it all with quiet pride. He had seen Diep grow from a fragile soul into a woman of strength, of grace, of quiet fire. And now, he saw her whole. Later that night, as the family gathered for a meal under the stars, Diep took James's hand. "I never thought I'd find them," she said softly. "And now that I have, I don't know how to begin again." James smiled gently. "You don't have to begin alone." She looked at him, eyes full of gratitude. "You didn't just help me find my family," she whispered. "You helped me find myself." The stars above shimmered, and laughter echoed through the trees. The night was no longer lonely. The past was no longer a wound. It was a story, painful, yes, but also beautiful. And from that story, a new chapter was ready to be written, together. That night was filled with voices, old, cracked, tender. Tu Diep sat beside her mother, holding her weathered hands as though they might disappear again. Round them, distant relatives came and went, some bringing photographs, others food, some simply standing nearby as if afraid to speak, afraid this was all a dream. James watched from the porch of the wooden house, letting her have this moment, her moment. But even from where he sat, he could feel the quiet tremble in her shoulders as she listened to stories of the past. "They told us you were taken far away, married off," one cousin said. "I dreamed of you once," her grandmother whispered with fading eyes. "You were standing in a field of sunflowers, and you looked happy. I always hoped that dream meant something." Tu Diep didn't speak much. She just listened. Her heart, like an overfilled cup, had no more space for words. Only tears rolled silently down her cheeks, not just of sorrow, but of something else too, forgiveness. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Tu Diep stepped away from the gathering and walked alone toward the river. The moon shimmered in its reflection. She crouched down, dipping her hands into the cool water, and whispered to herself, "Am I really home?" She didn't notice when James came up behind her. "You disappeared," he said gently. "I needed a moment." She stood up, brushing her hair from her face. "It's strange. I've searched for years without knowing what I was searching for. Now that I've found them, I feel both full and empty at the same time." James nodded, stepping closer. "That's what truth feels like sometimes. Heavy, beautiful, and impossible to hold all at once." She looked at him, eyes glistening. "Will they accept me now? After all this time?" "They already have," he said. "But it's not about being accepted. It's about choosing whether you let the past define you or let it guide you into something new." There was silence, then a breeze. Then she took his hand. "James," she said quietly, Thank you for staying, always. But the peace didn't last long. The next morning, just as sunlight slipped through the misty mountain air, a young man from the village came running toward the house. "There's a man looking for Diep," he said breathlessly. "He says he's from the city. He brought documents." Tu Diep's heart dropped. She and James exchanged a glance. Could it be someone from her past again? Someone connected to the land dispute, or POW? They followed the boy to the village center, where a tall man in a gray coat stood beside a dusty motorbike. He was holding a file, thick, official, and sealed. "You are Tu Diep?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I work with the provincial court," he said. "I came here because there's been a legal motion filed under your name. It concerns land that was once owned by your biological father. That land has now been sold illegally by your uncle." Diep's blood turned cold. "Why now?" James asked firmly. "Why are you telling her this just after she finds her family?" "Because," the man replied, "this land now holds value. Developers want it, and unless Ms. Tu Diep claims her right, everything will be lost." The peace they had just found was being pulled away again. But this time, Tu Diep didn't shake. She didn't run. She straightened her back, looked the man in the eye, and said, "Then I will go. I will face it." James squeezed her hand. Not alone. Her mother stepped forward, trembling. "You don't have to get involved in this mess, child." "I do," Diep replied, "because this isn't just about land. It's about truth and justice and finally having a voice." And so, once again, Tu Diep would return to the city, but she was no longer the same girl. She was no longer a forgotten orphan, a poor village girl, or a pawn in anyone's game. She was Tu Diep, daughter, woman, survivor, and this time, she would fight not to find her past, but to protect her future. Sometimes, the most powerful journeys are not the ones that take us across great distances, but the ones that lead us back to the questions we buried deep inside our hearts. Tu Diep grew up surrounded by silence, the kind that isn't quiet, but painfully loud in the form of unanswered questions. Who were her parents? Why did they disappear? Did she matter to anyone at all? For years, she lived with these questions as invisible weights tied to her soul. No amount of smiles could cover the longing in her eyes, the ache that came with every family she saw walking hand in hand. She learned to survive, not by forgetting, but by learning how to live without answers. But the truth has a strange way of coming back when you least expect it. And when it does, it doesn't always come gently. Diep's reunion with her family was not wrapped in joy alone. It came with guilt, grief, and the painful realization that time cannot be turned back. There were stories she had never heard, faces she had never seen, and wounds that had never healed. Yet, what she discovered that day was more important than any missing piece of her past. She was never truly forgotten. Somewhere, someone had always been waiting. This story teaches us something incredibly human, that family is not only defined by presence, but also by longing, memory, and forgiveness. People make mistakes, lives get separated, hearts break, but when love is still alive, even in the smallest corner of the soul, there is always a way home. Tu Diep also teaches us the strength of choosing peace over bitterness. She had every right to be angry, to reject those who abandoned her, but instead, she opened her heart, not because the past could be changed, but because healing could only begin with acceptance. And James, he reminds us of the kind of love that is rare, a love that doesn't try to fix your past, but walks beside you as you face it. He stood quietly beside her, letting her find her own answers, never leaving her side. Through him, we see that true love is not loud. It is patient, it is steady, it is loyal,